Hello, fellas. Welcome back. So this episode was with James Robinson. He's a British economist and political scientist, and he studies what makes countries different by focus on the underlying economic and political institutions that lead some to prosperity and then others to conflict. He's most famously co-authored the international best-selling book, Why Nations Fail. He's conducted research in many countries around the world, including Botswana, Chile, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, the Philippines, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Colombia, and I am sure very many more as well. The coolest and most insightful takeaway from Why Nations Fail is the long explanation that distinguishes between inclusive and extractive institutions. This dynamic ultimately explains why some nations fail and then why some nations succeed. The book was strongly endorsed by Jared Diamond, and it was for that reason for why I initially picked it up, but once you get into it, it is the historical anecdotes that keep you around. For me, the most fascinating topic is how and why nations differ, from economy to geography to culture. So as you can imagine, this chat meant specifically a lot to me. And if you're listening to this on the Geopolitics and Power podcast feed, then allow me to just take this brief moment to endorse the website, atlasgeographica.com. So if we've made it this far through the myriad of internet distractions down to this specific interaction where maybe you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on one of the podcast feeds, then allow me to suggest that we have similar interests. We found each other here because of James Robinson and Why Nations Fail and an interest in geopolitics and culture and some of the themes of the book. But there is a lot more that's happening there on atlasgeographica.com. That's the website. Lots of writing. And then as an extension from that, there are some podcasts as well. So allow me to suggest that we might have more things in common than we do not, and that especially will be most true to the field of interests. So check out the website and jump on the newsletter as well. And I don't really want to say much more about endorsing and stuff. So no more delay. This is my chat with James Robinson, co-author of Why Nations Fail and political scientist and economist for so many developing nations around the world. He's fascinating. His ideas are fascinating. His books is fascinating. I really hope that you enjoy this chat. Well, Mr. Robinson, James Robinson, thank you so much for giving me some time, your morning, my afternoon. And welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. Yes, my pleasure.
Like I said, we'll just kick right into it. And what I wanted to open with is a sort of anecdote you gave in your presentation to Google. So obviously you're an economist, and a big part of your work in your life is sort of conducting research in developing nations. It seems mostly Latin America and Africa, but I'm sure it's Asia as well. But you made a comment that you work in the DRC a lot, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I just want to ask you specifically, what is the work that you're doing there, and what's your relationship been with that country?
I have many different projects in the DRC. I think there's something for anyone who studies Africa and the history of Africa. There's something sort of fascinating about the DRC, and I think especially for someone who's interested in African development, because there's been such a perverse interaction between the DRC and the rest of the world. In some sense, that's where in the early 15th century, that's where the early 16th century, that's where the sort of transatlantic slave trade started, when the Portuguese started getting the Kingdom of the Congo to sell them slaves. And it's where the most egregious colonial exploitation took place. And it's been, one of the most traumatic post-colonial experiences. President Mobutu became the epitome of this sort of predatory African dictator. So I think there's something fascinating about the country. It's wildly under-researched by social scientists, and I got very fascinated by it through the work of Jan van Sina, who's a great historian of the political history of Central Africa, and he wrote a book called The Children of Woot, which was about the history of the Kuba Kingdom, which was a pre-colonial state in the south of the DRC. And I read that book and it just blew me away. And I just thought to myself, I need to research this. So I went to the Kuba Kingdom and
Oh.
Mushenge, which is the capital of the old Kuba state. And so
And what year is that?
the first project I did was inspired by Vansina's book and trying to study the impact of this pre-colonial state formation on Congolese society. But since then, it's spread into many other topics and areas.
And what year was that when you first went?
That was about 11 years ago. 10,
Oh, okay.
10
So,
years ago. Yeah.
so I suppose on a big time scale, it's still relatively recent.
Yeah, I mean, compared to I've been working in Colombia for 27 years. So
Hmm.
yeah, compared to that, working in the work that I did in Africa, I'd say the first work I really did in Africa was actually in Botswana, which
Yeah.
was
Oh,
22 years ago. That's when I first
yeah.
went to Botswana, trying to understand why had Botswana been such an incredibly successful country politically and economically since independence, such an anomaly in Africa.
I absolutely loved the chapters and the paragraphs that were devoted to Botswana. One of my favorite university professors back at UTS in Sydney was Botswanan,
Hmm.
and he was the first man I'd met who was a super proud African who wanted to tell people about the beauties of his continent, but also his country, and spark a little bit of interest about this sort of land that we in Australia just knew that we played cricket against South Africa and rugby against South Africa, but that's kind of where the knowledge or the interest in the continent stopped. In the Congo, you said it's wildly under researched. Is this a consequence of it just being like a geographical consequence? I mean, it's just a dense jungle, right? And then also the political instability. It just makes it a hard place for research to be conducted.
Yeah, I think it's a lot is to do with the political instability and the fact that the government doesn't collect data, and so you have to go. You can't download anything from a web page. You have to go and collect data yourself, and there's just a lot of logistical
Yeah.
challenges, and there's no roads, and to get around, you have to get around on dodgy Congolese air. So I think there's a lot of logistical barriers that make it very difficult. Like
Mm.
they put people off. Even though culturally, and it's just an absolutely fascinating place. But yes, there's some entry barriers, we'd say, in economics. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What has the changes been that you've just seen in 11 years alone? Have there been any significant changes?
Oh gosh, that's a complicated. I think there have been changes. But it's complicated to put your finger on it. It depends on where you are. The Congo is like a sort of archipelago. The east is very unstable. It's full of tens of, I don't know how many different armed groups there are, but close to 100 maybe. The government,
Wild. There.
in the Kasais, the government doesn't really control the east of the country.
Hmm.
Uh, there's some there's some progress. I mean, I think Congo, since it became independent, it's been struggling to find a sort of social contract. It's been struggling to find some consensus about how to organize things and how to allocate power. And I'm not sure it's really there yet, but I think there's still this. Gosh, I think there is progress. The roads are a
Sure.
little bit better, but there's just so many challenges still.
Mm. Because they are more or less sort of like the archetypal extractive economy, aren't they? Um, and that is something I wanted to ask you a little bit later. But from that premise as them being this like classic example of the downside of all the extraction, perhaps they're still in the throes of wild extraction and not making their way towards inclusivity.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle. I mean, the way I think about this probably changed a lot from having been there, over 10 years, and sort of having talked to people and tried to sort of understand in a deeper way. I think a lot of the social science literature, which perhaps influenced the way I thought about this
Mm.
15 years ago, is pretty superficial in
Okay.
terms of understanding what went on and why it went on. I mean, the way I think about President Mobutu nowadays, for example, is probably very different from the way I thought about him 15 years ago and the way he's
Really?
portrayed. I would
Like
say
more empathetic or more judgmental?
no, I'm not sure empathetic is the right word, but I think one can understand better why he did what he did. When you get into
Okay.
the details of it, what's interesting is the extent to which he, in some sense, he took a very traditional model of how African political authority was supposed to work, right the way down to the leopard skin hat and the witchcraft and everything, the
Yeah,
praise
yeah.
song. And he sort of tried to scale it up to this massive, and it was just sort of incoherent. I mean, it just didn't
Hmm.
work at that level. But you sort of understood why I understand much better why he did it. I think if you look around Africa in the 1960s, you see very different models of how to construct sort of legitimate authority in these newly independent countries. Suddenly there's this thing called Nigeria, and there's
Hmm.
hundreds of different people with different cultures and political traditions and languages, and they're all in this thing together, and
Hmm.
they have to somehow build institutions to make the society cohere, and that turns out to be a very difficult problem. So I think it's easy to be judgmental from the outside, but on the inside, you get more of a sense of how complicated a problem that was to solve. With no obvious models of how you do that.
So, you say Nigeria, like a collection of hundreds of different cultures and even maybe thousands of languages. It sounds like the Congo is quite similar. Is having huge cultural diversity from the get-go one of the biggest barriers to creating those inclusive institutions? Which, by the way, a definition for inclusive institutions, for those listening, we'll definitely get to that. But it's kind of like the thesis of why nations fail. But nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I could give it now if you like. By inclusive,
Oh,
we could come.
no, hold on. I reckon
I
we can do it
think,
nice.
my general view of diversity is that diversity is a great thing. Diversity is what creates innovation. It creates new ideas. It creates new perspectives, and so
Yeah.
I think diversity is a good thing. And I think if you look at the history of Africa, what's interesting is probably compared to any other part of the world, Africans are so used to dealing with diversity, and they created all sorts of mechanisms for doing that. Here's an interesting fact for you, which is that
Okay.
in most African languages, the word for guest, stranger, and foreigner are the same. So if
That
I
speaks
say
volumes,
you're
doesn't
a
it?
foreigner or a stranger,
Yeah.
it's the same word for guest.
Hmm.
There's only one other language in the world in which that's true outside of Africa, which is Hawaiian. But the Polynesians moved
Right.
around a lot as well. They were great seafarers. So
Yeah.
so so I you know I think so I think I would say historically, actually, Africans are very used to dealing with all of this, and there's lots of cultural ways that they can deal with it. And any African society, for example, you look at. I mean, Botswana. You mentioned Botswana. Botswana is actually a fascinating example of this. That the last census, which is in 1948, where they tried to systematically record people's, identities or ethnicities, you could say,
Hmm.
or languages. What you see is that actually these Swana tribes were incredibly heterogeneous. They incorporated all sorts of people from all over southern Africa. People were moving about, and they were political entities that
Hmm.
incorporated all sorts of people. I'd say, like, from that perspective, Africa sort of has an advantage. It's not like English people, who can't stand the French, and they wanted to build a big wall,
Yeah.
to keep all the Europeans out of England. Africans are not like that in my experience. But nevertheless, this creation of these, colonialism created these new things. It created these new entities. It created lots of tensions and problems that Africans hadn't had to deal with historically. So maybe they didn't have the tools to deal with those problems, and that takes time. That takes time to figure that out. But I think there's a lot of progress from that perspective in Africa. There's a lot of people are figuring it out. People are adapting, and it just took time. And the same thing was true in Latin America. If you look in the 19th century, after Latin America becomes independent, the first 50 years looks a bit like Africa. There's economic decline, there's
Mm.
political instability, there's civil wars, there's they're trying to decide. Argentines, like, we're Argentines. How do we organize Argentina? What does the constitution look like? What do the rules look like? We're Colombians. The Colombians are still trying to figure that out, by the way. But so you see analogies. It's difficult to exit from colonial rule, I think, is the big story. But they're doing it. Yeah.
Really fascinating. And also, I do want to ask later more about European colonialism specifically as well, because that is also a chapter dedicated to it. But I didn't want this comment to fly by. You said that a lot of the social sciences was a little bit superficial. Can you open up on that a little bit more?
Well, I think
Without getting you in trouble, of course.
I think the reality is that a lot of social theory was devised by white European men who kind of based it on an interpretation. It's a sort of generalization of interpretations of European and Western history, European and Western economic development, European and Western political development. And then the next step is just to say, well, everything else is just the same, basically. Look at economics. Economics is all about markets and prices and property rights and etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you get this very elaborate sort of construction of economic theory, and then it's sort of like that everything is the same, like the rest of the world, it's the same. But that's a kind of ludicrous thing, because anyone
you can never account for all the variables, right? Your model is always going to be missing some crucial variables.
Well, it's not just that. It's just that African economies, for example, historically, were organized in fundamentally different ways. They were not organized like Western market. Property rights were different. Exchange was different. Notions of value were different. Like, the whole thing is different. If you constructed economic theory based on knowledge of Africa, you'd have come up with an economic theory that looked completely different from the type of economic theory that people developed in 19th century or 20th century England. So how generalizable is that understanding of the world? And think about politics. Like, we have this idea of the way political institutions work, and what legitimate authority looks like, and what to worry about. But if you look at China, or the history of political theory in China, that looks totally different. Okay, so who's right? We're right and they're wrong. Maybe I think that we don't really have a very sophisticated comparative understanding of social science, in my view, which means that taking Western ideas and sort of going to Africa with all these ideas in your head about how things should work and that's a very confusing experience for me, and that was a very confusing experience for me, and it's been a big learning exercise, I would say. Yeah.
What you're describing so well is Nassim Taleb's Procrustean bed metaphor. Are you familiar with it?
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. I just want to say it in case
one
the
of
people
the labors of Theseus, isn't it? Or I don't know if they were labors, but it's when Theseus is trying to get back to Athens, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and he stays in the inn of Procrustes, and then but basically the idea that you're explaining how the European white men came up with this sort of model for how Africa works, rather than letting the reality shape their model, they tried fitting reality into their
exactly. It's what model. There's a lot of what social psychologists call motivated reasoning. Like you have a model of the world, and then you process information in a way to reconfirm your model of the world. I feel like there's a lot of research on Africa like that, and so I've been trying to sort of deprogram myself. I would say for the
how's that going?
I think it's
is it starting to push against
progress. I've made some progress, I should say. I've made some progress on that, but it's very difficult. You come with all these preconceptions about how the world works. You're having grown up in Western countries or whatever. And so you have to really be open to think about things in a very different way. Like nowadays, whenever I'm teaching things, I'm teaching these PhD students at the moment, I just try to question everything I say to them. Is that right? I think that's what you have to do. You just have to endlessly challenge yourself. Yeah.
I didn't plan on going down this tangent, but I'm quite interested in you and how you're spending your time, because maybe I'm just here projecting and romanticizing a little bit your line of work, but I mean, you're going to the Congo, providing some sort of insight that I imagine has some sort of like tangible return and benefit to one particular group or a larger group. Colombia, as you've mentioned, I mean, your dedication at the beginning of the book is in Spanish, so I'm assuming maybe it's your wife that's Colombian. I'm not sure. And then you're obviously living in Chicago, an Englishman. Like, how's the time spent? Are you sort of jet setting around the world, taking on important projects to do with governments and big multinationals? Am I over romanticizing it? How does it work? Like,
Yeah,
the
I don't know. I mean,
international economist.
I mean, I wouldn't, over romanticize it. I don't speak African languages. I think my ability to understand stuff is very limited. That would be my starting point. I'm doing my best. I don't do things too much for governments, actually.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure I have the right mindset for it, because in the sense that, like, people who advise governments have to they always pretend they know what's true and what to do. And maybe that's an effective way of advising governments. But that's not kind of the way I think about the world. I'm just kind of fraught with uncertainty and sort of, oh, it's all so complicated. And
Mm-hmm.
I do know. And I did talk a lot to the former Prime Minister of the DRC, Mr. Matata, because
Okay.
I became convinced that he was a very serious man, and he was surrounded by very serious people. Like and in fact, I learned a lot just interacting with him. And when I first met him, and I met with his cabinet and all his people in Kinshasa. It was very interesting because the first thing I noticed was that he's from a place called Kindu in Maniema in the middle of Congo, and then
Okay.
nobody else in the room was from Maniema. Whereas, like in Africa, everyone is supposed to be from the same ethnic group, right? Nobody. This guy was from Gemena. He was from Bakongo. He was, he was from Bandundu, and it was very odd. And I thought, oh, this is not how it's supposed to be, And then the other idea is in Africa, everyone shuffles people all the time. People are in, people out. Yeah, I came back 6 months later. It was exactly the same. 6 months later, same people. Even now, he's not prime minister anymore. He did a PhD. He's teaching at the Protestant university. He has this NGO. Same people are working for him. Like there's just, just that sort of, and even the drivers work for him. Maniema, like even the guy who was driving you around Kinshasa. So I just sort of, that it's just a little thing. It's just an anecdote, but it was so different from what I was led to believe happened in a place like Congo based on what the books I'd read. It was sort of revealing. And he was just very serious. He was just a very serious man. He was always asking me questions. What about this? What do we learn about this? How do we know about China? What do we know about South Korea? What do we know about? And I felt like he wants to know stuff. And so I organized conferences with him. He wanted to organize a conference last year with me for the 60th anniversary of the independence of Congo. But of course it didn't happen because of COVID. So I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to you that I don't know that what I did. I didn't offer him a plan. I didn't tell him he should do this or didn't do that. I just helped him think through problems, and I'm very happy to do that if I feel there's somebody, genuinely engaged and serious. And there are many people like that in politics. But I wouldn't, I'm not really in the business of advising a government. My commitment my wife is Colombian, and I teach every summer in Bogota. I've taught every summer in Bogota since 1994, a long time.
Wow, fantastic.
And so I go every summer. I teach, the summer school, and that's been a fantastic thing for me because I've had so many students. Like many students, I collaborate with many of my former PhD students, Colombians. They come to the US or Europe to study, to do master's degrees, to do PhDs. I've done research probably with 10 of my former Colombian students. I have many former PhD students teaching in Colombia, in Bogota, in Medellin, in Barranquilla, so I don't know what that is. I tend not to get involved with politicians in Colombia. I've resisted the temptation.
Okay.
Because I'm an academic. I'm just an academic. I'm not some big important person. I just try to understand the world and help other people do that. But helping. That I feel like I've done some good with in
Sure.
Colombia. Like again, I don't know. I just try to create opportunities for people, to the extent I can, and get them excited about social science and so that's my sort of Colombian project, I guess.
Nice. And again, like I said to you before, I do have questions for days. A lot that I'd love to learn about Colombia because I imagine you have very unique insight of the country. But we've gone 25 minutes without mentioning the book. So let's introduce the book. Where did the idea come from? And it's a collaborative effort with Daron Ekemoglu.
Yeah.
So how does that work? What was the contribution from each of you? Where did the idea for the book come from? And how's it been received since it was published?
Yeah, well, we met, I think, 29 years ago when I gave a job talk at the London School of Economics, and he was a PhD student, and we've been friends ever since. And we've been working together for about 26 years, probably. And we must have written over 50 scientific papers together. So, he's my best friend. We talk on the telephone every day. We've written all these papers together. I don't think there's an idea I've had in the last 26 years that I haven't
run by
with him. So I think it's very difficult for me to say whose idea was what and who did which bit. And we're so good at working together and sort of dividing tasks. And it's like I don't know. Like I find it difficult to talk about that. It's difficult. It's difficult to articulate it. So I think the book. We wrote a lot of academic papers that were very successful, that people liked a lot, but our inspiration's often been from history. I was talking about Jan van Siena's work on the Congo and anthropology, other social. I felt that the economics I learned as a PhD student basically was like an empty box. When I actually came to trying to understand the problems in poor countries. It just didn't contain.
That would have been such a letdown.
It didn't contain. It was a beautiful thing, but it actually didn't contain the concepts which were relevant for understanding, why a country like Colombia was how it was, And I think a lot of the work, Daron and I, we had exactly the same sort of feeling, and so a lot of our work has been sort of trying to put what we thought was missing into that. I guess, it's funny how once you're trained, in a particular way, like trained as an economist, you're sort of socialized into thinking that this is how you do research. So, it's sort of like our research has been, here's economics, and it's just, you're just trying to put all these things in, and, maybe one could have done it differently, but there's a lot of path dependence in life, isn't there? And so we wrote all these academic papers, but of course, a lot of it is published. Most of it is published in economics journals, and economists are not interested in the details. They're not interested in the history, and so we'd endlessly get these papers back from journals, and they would like, oh, you have to delete that section, or delete this, or delete that. So we were just like building up all of these stories or historical episodes, which in some sense had inspired a lot of the research, but then the paper comes out in this very kind of arid academic form.
Yeah.
So at some point we started thinking, gosh, like if all this material had inspired us, maybe it would inspire other people too, or maybe it would get other people to think about the world. So that's sort of how it started. And then I was teaching at Harvard at the time. And then we sort of said, okay, like why let's put a course together. Let's try to put this into a course and see if it makes sense. So putting the course together, then we sort of saw how we could organize material, and that's how it started. But I don't think, the way Daron and I work, it's difficult to tell we everything is the two of us. We go backwards and forwards. I write something, he rewrites it. He writes, I just I can't say who did what or who thought of what. I can hardly remember myself mostly.
So what year was it published?
2012.
And how has, because it was it was like a phenomenal bestseller, right? I mean, just by the like the domain of book publishing is extremely long-tailed, right? So, how did your life change at all once the book became a success? Did it open up a lot of new opportunities, or was it sort of just more of the same between you and?
I think it did open up. I mean, it's been very interesting. You get to meet all sorts of people who you would never have met otherwise, because, and I don't think we sort of understood that. We didn't really understand. I think we did. We tried to make it very accessible. We could have written it in a more academic way or a less academic way. We tried to write it in an accessible way, and I think that's actually because you take Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. There's a lot of intelligent people out there in the world, educated people asking questions about how things are, and so and I remember thinking my father-in-law was reading Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he was asking me all these questions about it, and he was really into it, and I thought, like, he's an engineer, so he's an educated man and everything, but so I thought, that's pretty cool, if you can actually write something, where
an explanation of how we got here.
You can connect with somebody like that. So I think that was our aspiration. It's not clear that, it's not clear that it wasn't clear to us that we were capable of writing such a book. So somehow we did it. We did it anyway, and that's been very fun. It's very fun when somebody just like that. I get emails all the time from people just saying, oh, I read your book, I really found it interesting, and that's like, it's very thrilling when you get an email like that. So I find that, and and all sorts of people, like business people. I went to this, business people come and invite you to. And you learn all sorts of things. Actually, you meet people who you'd never meet ordinarily, and you learn all sorts of things, not just politicians, but business people, and that's been actually extremely interesting. Yeah, I get presidents and people asking me to come and talk about the book and meet with them, and like I went to Ecuador and met with former President Correa, who's a very educated man. He has a PhD in economics, and he'd read the book. You could see like they had the highlighting in the book, and we had this fantastic conversation about the book for an hour, and that sort of thing is. It's really interesting, so, and I've learned a lot of things. I've learned a lot of things from that I didn't know. So yeah, and I wasn't expecting that to happen. I really wasn't. Yeah.
Was the idea of extractive and inclusive institutions, was that original to Why Nations Fail, or was that an idea that you had teased out in papers before the book was published?
So I think it partly, the notion of extractive institutions we sort of developed in one of our early papers, this paper on colonial origins, which was, I think that's our most successful academic paper in terms of citations. But actually we didn't have terminology for the opposite of extractive. It was sort of degrees of extractive. But in some sense, to write the book, we realized that we needed a word for the opposite thing of extractive, and actually it was a very good friend of ours, Tim Besley, who's a professor, very distinguished, actually Sir Tim Besley, who's a very distinguished economist at the London School of Economics. We were at a conference in Buenos Aires, and we went to have lunch in the Plaza de San Telmo, if you know Buenos Aires at all, and Tim, we said, like, Tim, come on, like, and Tim came up with this idea of this word inclusive, and we immediately realized that that's the perfect word for what we're talking about. It's completely the opposite of extractive institutions. And so that was, we tried to come up with, the thing about the world is complicated, and all the details are so different, so if you want to compare, North Korea and Sierra Leone and Colombia, all the details are different, and you need a sort of language that allows you to see, despite all those differences of the details, these places all have something in common. What is it? And so that I think that terminology was very important. That seemed to resonate with people, and but yeah, it was Tim Besley who came up with inclusive. I claim no credit.
And you said like the difference between North Korea, Ecuador, and another country, and how try explanations beforehand to try and explain why they might have been developing whilst other nations were developed. But what the book does initially is it sort of expels the three sort of classic explanations for why a nation failed. The geographical hypothesis, the cultural hypothesis, and the ignorance hypothesis. And I really loved reading about that because I was quite, I still don't know much about it at all, but I was ignorant to these ideas, right? Because it is easy for one to try and sort of explain, well, Africa is always going to be stifled and poor because look at their geography. You can't transport down the river system. They don't have natural harbors. It's got no roads. And you could make this geographical explanation. I wanted to ask you if you could lay out the argument for why the extractive inclusive matrix way of looking at things to evaluate a country is better opposed to those three classical hypotheses. If you could disprove the three hypotheses and then prove extractive inclusive.
Yeah, I think scientifically disproving them, it takes data and data analysis, and that's what a lot of our papers did, early scientific papers. Of course, that's not the book tries to use simpler ways of thinking about that. It tries to use what we call natural experiments, like take the Korea, the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula is, sort of has 1,000 years of centralized state authority, common language and culture and history, and and then it gets arbitrarily split in half at the end of the Second World War, and the North gets a sort of communism slapped on top of it, and the South, gets this capitalist market economy. Okay, the book is not about communism and capitalism; it's about extractive and inclusive institutions. But the point there is that it's almost like a sort of experiment, where you create these very different. You take a place which is very culturally and geographically homogeneous, and you create these very different institutions with very different incentives, and you get this massive economic divergence. So that can't be explained by geography or culture. It's got to be explained by the fact that these institutions create very different patterns of incentives and opportunities. So we use examples like that. We lead with this example of Nogales. Nogales is sort of split down the middle with a fence, and half of it is in Mexico and half of it is in the United States. And again, that's it's a very culturally, geographically homogeneous place. But there's enormous economic divergence because part of it is under the institutions of the United States, and the other part is under the institutions of Mexico. So that's we use that to kind of rule out these other hypotheses. In the book, that's sort of the approach we take because that just seems much more intuitive, and we want to stay out of data and things like that.
It is much more intuitive. Like anyone who can look on a map or knows about the North Korean anecdote or has traveled to Mexico or America, that it's very easy to conceptualize that straight away. It's like, obviously the geographical argument doesn't work here, and obviously the cultural argument doesn't work here, and more mass menos, neither does the ignorance hypothesis. But I just wonder, in those specific areas, you can create your sort of specific explanation for why that's the exception there. I'm asking you to do a difficult thing, obviously, which is to sort of explain globally why those three hypotheses just don't work. Because if you take the Nogales US example, you can explain your way out of it. Same with the North Korea, South Korea.
I think there's lots of different ways of seeing that. One thing we pointed out in one of our scientific papers is there's this supposed fact that tropical countries are poorer than temperate latitudes, But if you think about, just take the Americas and think about the history of the Americas, and you go far enough back in time, let's say go back 500 years, actually the opposite was true. Where was the political and economic development in the Americas at the time of colonialism? Not in North America and Canada, Central America, the Mexicas or the Mayas were sort of in decline by that time. Or the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was an incredible thing. They built tens of thousands of miles of road. They had a famine relief system, granaries, they produced public goods. I mean, it was
an famine relief system.
Yeah, yes, they had this incredibly organized society, the Incas. What was there in North America? Nothing. There was nothing. So if anything, if you think about development, it was the tropical places that were more affluent than the what about the South, Latin Argentina or Chile? There was nothing there, compared to Andy. So that was an enormous reversal. Actually, there was a huge reversal, and this pattern within the Americas of the temperate zones are more prosperous is actually a consequence of colonialism. It's not something intrinsic to kind of geography or anything like that. It was a consequence of institutional creation during the colonial period. So I think there's many. That's an example, in some sense, where you see that there can't be any persistent kind of constant relationship between geography and prosperity. It's all to do with what sort of societies humans create, essentially. And I think the same is true in Africa. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence showing that these claims about African prosperity being a consequence of geography are just completely incorrect. And I've always found it wildly implausible, personally. Just never coincided with any intuition or idea I had it being in Africa, and Africans are just So I could give other pieces of evidence, but that's the sort of strategy we take. We just try to take these historical experiments and just try to show that really challenges these ideas about the relationship between geography and culture. The Korean thing is an interesting example of culture. I think with culture it depends. Cultures are different. Cultures are different in the world, But I guess, we'd say, think about the China, we could discuss cultural differences but my impression is that doesn't really get in the way of, people value their cultures and they love their cultures and they're attached to their cultures. But people, in my experience, they all aspire to all the stuff that, you and I have, access to education, security, healthcare, traveling, jobs, all sorts of things. They don't want a government that exploits them and suppresses them or represses them. They want freedoms and political freedoms and economic freedoms. And, in my experience of working in different parts of the world, people have very similar aspirations like that. And so that's the kind of presupposition of the work, but they can't enjoy those things because they're living under these extractive institutions in so much of the world.
Yeah, the differences between cultures are usually just the details, right? But the macro view is kind of universal. And then just to re-say what you said there, but off the back of that, can you define, because what inclusive extractive does very well is it almost gives a global explanation, which you can then locally apply, right? So off the back of that, could you define for us what is an inclusive economy, both politically and economically, and then extractive, please?
Yeah, I think the thing to bear in mind before getting to the definition is, what is it that creates prosperity? We're trying to explain why is it that some parts of the world are more prosperous than others. And economists have known, and I think they got this right since the work of Robert Solow, actually the great MIT economist Robert Solow in the 1950s, that it's innovation. It's innovation, it's creativity, it's new ideas, it's entrepreneurship. That's what creates prosperity. That's what increases productivity of human labor. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, that really created the world we see today, created all the inequalities we see in the world. That's all about innovation, about mechanization of production, the steam engine, the railway, the factory system. So to be prosperous, a country has to just tap into, it has to find a way of tapping into all that latent talent and energy and ambition and, like the visions and dreams, or the things that makes human society so kind of interesting and fun, right? The kind of nuttiness and originality of humans. And so, but where is that? Where is that talent? Where are those people? You don't know where they are. You need so the word inclusion, I'm sort of saying this because the word inclusion turns out to be very significant, even though we didn't come up with it, which is that, you need a system of rules, of institutions that creates very broad-based incentives and opportunities. So you can tap into all that latent talent in society. Like the thing you see like in a place like Congo is just so much wasted talent, so many clever people, so many, who just have no opportunities. There's no road, there's no school, there's no there's just no way out, and so inclusive institutions are, institutions that create broad-based incentives and opportunities. And extractive are the opposite. Extractive institutions, put barriers to opportunity, and they create incentives for some people and not for other people, and that creates wealth for some people, but it creates poverty for the mass of people.
Can you define them both through like a country profile? What is sort of an archetypally extractive economy and politic, so we can then understand the definition much better through example, and then the same for inclusive?
So I like a lot, the example, the first chapter of the book where we tell the story of the history of economic divergence between North America and Latin America. We end the chapter with an example that I like very much, which is not two countries, but two people, which is Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, who at the time we wrote,
that's a great one.
Richest men in the world. I mean, they're still in the ballpark. I think Jeff Bezos may have overtaken them or whatever, So
still bloody rich.
So they're very rich. But, what's important here is not how rich they are, but how they made their money, So Carlos Slim made his money through getting his friends in the one party state to privatize the telecom monopoly to himself. Bill Gates made his money through innovation. He made his money through Microsoft, the operating system,
to create new value.
Exactly. And why was he doing that? Did Bill Gates not think about being a monopolist like Carlos Slim? Of course he did. Microsoft was found guilty of violating the Sherman Act for monopolistic practices. They're all at it. Apple, Facebook, all of them. Everybody wants to be a monopolist. They're all at it. It's just more difficult to get away with it in the United States. Why is it more difficult to get away with it? Because of the institutions, because of things like the Sherman Act, because the state can enforce the Sherman Act on the richest guy in the world. That's unthinkable in Mexico. Absolutely unthinkable in any level.
And the reason it's unthinkable is because of sort of the political corruption, right? And ultimately, that's the biggest.
State is captured by these people because there's dictatorship and because there's the massive failure of accountability, because there's no public pressure on the state to enforce rules on these people. So I think that example drives home brilliantly, like how the institutions matter and how this is not about culture. It's not about like Hispanic culture bad, Anglo-Saxon American culture. No. Gates would have been just like that, except he was in a different institutional environment.
The political institution then backed up by the economic institutions that then creates the prosperity.
Our view is we're sort of political determinists. For us, the economics is incredibly important for creating economic incentives, but ultimately it's the politics that creates different economic institutions. It's really that's the key. So for us, you could say, well, in some general way, don't politics and economics interact? And I could say yes, actually, but all the research, all the scientific research we've done suggests that it's the politics that really drives things. So in Why Nations Fail, it's really, yes, you need to have inclusive economic institutions, but if you want to have inclusive economic institutions, you better have inclusive political institutions. That's why we think this whole Chinese growth experience is not sustainable, because China was able to grow by making economic institutions more inclusive. That's a good anti-cultural story too. It's not that
Yeah.
Chinese culture changed and suddenly China became more wealthy. No, they got rid of many elements of extractive
They
economic.
change your institutions.
Yeah, they started creating
Yeah.
incentives and opportunities, and people responded. But the political system never changed. And what we say in the book about that is that you can't have an inclusive economy in a sustainable way with extractive political institutions. It's a train wreck. What history suggests is that's a train wreck waiting to happen. Which is a scary thought for the world, but that's the prediction of the theory.
Can you reflect on political corruption for a moment? Is there an example that comes to mind of an inclusive, of a country say, where political corruption and inclusive institutions have ever aligned? Because I'm assuming no, but I just want to ask you if there's perhaps one rare exception.
Yeah, I don't use the word corruption, honestly. I mean, so I prefer.
Why is that?
Huh?
Why is that?
Because I don't think it's about corruption. I think it's about power. I think corruption is a sort of. I don't think the way people talk about the problem is corruption. I don't think it's about corruption. It's about access to power and the distribution of power, and maybe things go on that look like corruption, but I never find, and maybe this is more a kind of academic, picky kind of thing. I always find that when economists use the word corruption, they use it to avoid talking about politics. So that's why I don't. That may not be relevant to you.
It's a hot take, a good contrarian view to the idea of corruption. But it is. I'd love to understand that a little bit more, because I don't fully understand. I mean, there is something that is obviously corrupt is Carlos Slim just cutting in some of his friends to make sure that he can have this monopoly.
You could say it's corrupt. I mean, this could be a bit of Africa coming in, in the sense that, so for example,
in your changing worldview. Yeah.
In
Interesting.
Chicago, if I got a job, working for the mayor, and there's a lot of corruption in Chicago, by the way.
Yeah.
And I got a job working for the mayor, and I used that to kind of hire, my family or something. That would be called corruption. You're misusing public resources for some private objective. But in Africa, if you get a job working in the government in Congo, like the ethical situation is completely different. Here it would be unethical to use your position to help your family. In Congo, it would be unethical if you didn't help your family. Okay, you have all these people who are reliant on you. You have an opportunity to benefit, your network or your relatives or your extended kin group or something. The moral situation, I'm quite serious about this. The moral situation is completely different. You're violating the moral kind of order if you don't take advantage of that opportunity to help people, and I've seen that, and that's for real, So I think it's just a very different moral order, if you want my honest opinion. So
sure,
you can call that corruption if you like, but that doesn't really help.
Then let's look at the spectrum of corruption. Then, for example, if you go into Chicago politics and grease a few of your friends' palms, sure, that's manageable, small corruption. What about if you rise to become the president and now all of a sudden you're just putting 50% of the tax revenue into your private Swiss account? That's crazy corruption that's going to start stifling your entire economy. Surely the morals change there, because you're still doing it, by your rationale, you're still doing it to benefit your family because that's the right thing to do. But at a certain scale, you start to now hinder everyone else who and also a part of that is, being the leader, being the politician implies that you also have care for the community. It's not this individualistic thing that you've gone down.
Yeah. But I think those, the stories of the castles in Morocco and whatever it is, and that's a very small part. Yeah, that's going on, and it's not acceptable, and nobody's in favor of it in Africa, in my experience. Sorry, nobody's in favor of it. They can't stop it. They don't have the instruments or the mechanisms to stop it, but they're not. That doesn't. But but I think that's a very small part of the problem. I mean, I've never found any. What people will tell you in Congo, for example, is that President Mobutu, he basically squandered his entire fortune. Just kind of, it all goes out. It's like it just comes in and then it goes out again because you're endlessly trying to sort of make friends with people and build alliances and get supporters. And so there's a lot of redistribution. So I know these stories about the castles in Morocco are very kind of, they're fun and everything. And it just seems like terribly predatory and but I think that's a very small part of the problem in these countries.
So maybe that goes into inform our sort of survivorship bias of what the idea of corruption is, when in fact it's actually a tiny minutia, but because that's like the, I don't know, the exciting bit of corruption, it becomes the story that everyone knows about. But in fact, let's speak even about Mexico specifically. There is a terribly, horribly difficult situation to deal with. The sort of interplay between the drug cartels, the Mexican government, and then universal demand for this drug. There is, what do you make of this corruption, right? The fact that maybe the Mexican government is, I don't know, turning a blind eye or profiting from this, like this thing that's grown out of their economy because of basically where they are almost geographically. I'm not sure what I'm trying to ask you. I guess I'm just maybe being a bit pedantic, trying to get more out of this corruption idea from you, because I've never heard the idea of that. Maybe corruption. It's all about institutions. Because I guess I think
corruption. To the extent that corruption, is happening. It's a sort of symptom of institutional weakness. That would be another way I'd think about it. It's a symptom of the fact that the Mexican state is very weak, and it's easily controlled by outside. I mean, I'm much more familiar with the history of this in Colombia. And there it's interesting. Because Colombia isn't close to the United States, and Colombians didn't even grow coca. Like when the Medellin drug cartel started, the Colombians went to Peru and Bolivia and they bought the coca. They just acted as intermediaries.
Is that a fact?
They acted as intermediaries.
I've always been under the impression that the coca was the Colombian slice of the Amazon.
No. They brought it. They brought it.
Okay.
They brought it because they realized it was easier to control it in Colombia. Why is it easier to control it in Colombia? Because in Colombia, the government doesn't run half the country.
Yeah.
Half the country is a sort of vacuum of authority. So if you want to build, Tranquilandia, which was the first big coca plantation or Rodriguez Gacha built, and he built like this thousands of hectares of coca, like with an airfield, so they could ship it to the United States. Who noticed? No one noticed. The government didn't. No one paid any attention.
Insane, isn't it?
So I think that's like the Colombians. Colombians took over the industry just because institutions were so weak and there was this massive vacuum of authority. And there's also this certain kind of entrepreneurial aspect to Colombian society, which you don't have less so in Bolivia and Peru.
Sure,
so there was some sort of sociological thing, and then the Colombians, that sort of collapsed in Colombia and it moved to Mexico. But I think much of that is for similar reasons, that the state is very weak, and the authority of the state is very weak. Yeah, it's closer to the markets in Mexico, but that didn't matter when the Colombians were in action. So I mean, again, I would say, obviously there's this sort of underlying factor. Like why is it that institutions are incredibly weak in the Central African Republic? So why doesn't coca growing move to the Central African Republic? Well, it's far from the market, and and it's complicated logistically and whatever. So you need some human capital and submarines and airplanes, and they don't have that in the Central African Republic. So there are reasons why it's in Colombia or Mexico, but I would it's also a weakness of the American state in some sense, that like all of this stuff ends up on the street being sold.
And that's exactly what I wanted to get to.
I don't really understand why the US is so ineffective at stopping this.
Well, obviously, because of your experience in Colombia, I'm sure in conversations, drugs is always rather a dominant theme. At least I'm sure it was in the early 2000s, maybe not so anymore. But Mexico is like super close to my heart, right? And I have so much sympathy for this country because I think in their case specifically, there is obviously institutional failure, but they also are in this geographically bad hand just from the terms of drugs because the biggest consumer of these compounds in the world are their northern neighbor. And sure, you could make the argument that it could just be, the Guatemalans could be the traffickers, but they just don't share the land border. So it is like a geographical problem they have. And it's not just cocaine that they're shipping anymore. As I'm sure you're aware, there's loads of fentanyl and like these synthetic drugs are also being shipped into the thing. And I had a theory about it. I don't know if it's original. I'm sure it's not original. But you're an economist, so it'd be cool to run it by you. And this is a tangent that's not got anything to do with why nations fail. So, forgive me. But it's the idea that demand is a stronger force than supply, because the entire drug war has been about stifling supply. Burning cocoa fields, salting the earth so they can't grow any cocoa, getting rid of one cartel, trying to get the southern US border as strong as possible. All of these are actions taken to try and stop supply, when at the end of the day, as long as there is demand, there is going to be entrepreneurs who defeat whatever this challenge on supply is, and it will ultimately just rise the price. Although, ironically enough, we haven't seen much of a price change at all, which suggests that perhaps it's just really business as usual, no matter how much billions the US can throw at it, trying to stop supply. And so it's a very complicated issue, one which everyone has to be sympathetic to Mexico for, because, it's Europeans, Americans, they're buying this shitty drug, which does nothing for them, which is ultimately just laid in blood.
Yeah, and then the US should understand that, because if you go back to the history of prohibition, for example, exactly the same thing
exactly the same,
which is that there's just created this enormous illegal supply of alcohol, but the difference between, and then, and they got rid of it after what, like 12 years or something. But the difference, of course, between prohibition and this is that in prohibition, all the misery and violence was in the United States, whereas here the misery and violence is in Mexico.
Sure.
So it's not in
your feel the pain
way. I would say, by the way, though, there's one Colombian aphorism in this context that I like very much, which is due to a very famous Colombian writer, which is that in Colombia, politics corrupts drug dealing.
I'll write that down. Well, just to give you a taste of what the other things I really wanted to ask, things about great leaders who have created inclusive institutions. Obviously, your take on China. Is Botswana still the star people of Africa? Does foreign aid do more to help or hinder a nation? That's a great one. But given the time, I will ask the final two, which is sort of baselines that I have asked every guest.
Okay.
And that is the following. So, James, what country or region are you most bullish on looking into the future? Sort of, given your worldview, given all the research that you do, what is a country or a region in the world that you just are super excited about their future for?
Yeah, I think it's, one should hesitate to make predictions, but actually, I just wrote something. I wrote a paper which is on my webpage if you're interested, called Africa's Latent Assets, which is sort of how to be optimistic about African development if you want to be.
Latent assets.
Africa's latent assets, and the argument there is actually there's a lot of here's the example on the first page which I sort of like, which is if you'd been standing around in China in 1975, you would never possibly have predicted what happened in the 40 years after that. That suddenly a few changes would happen, and and the growth rate would go to 10% a year, and like the world, the most dramatic experience of economic growth in world history was about to be unleashed. So why was that? Well, it turned out that there were all sorts of aspects of Chinese society, I would say, which were terribly sort of conducive to capitalist development, like this notion of meritocracy. For example, if you there's all these Chinese students at the University of Chicago. They're having trouble getting in the country at the moment, but before the COVID, and Trump, there were all these Chinese students. So you talk to a Chinese student and ask, like, where are they from? Where did they grow up? Where are their parents from? They're everywhere. They're from everywhere. They're in China. talent can always get to the top. That's a very, if you read Confucius
Mm.
said, promote the worthy and talented, in the Analects. So that notion of sort of talent, what I would call achieved status, is very powerful in China. Compare that to India. That's not like that at all in
Opposite.
India.
Yeah, exactly.
If you meet an Indian student, they're all some Brahmin, who went to one of like 3 universities, like
Yeah.
President's College in Calcutta or whatever. Africa is much more like China. Africa, anyone can get ahead.
Mm.
Africa is also a place of achieved status. Like, just if you have talent, you can get ahead in Africa. That's a very powerful principle.
For sure, yeah.
You want
So
to
it
have.
promotes meritocracy. Because I think the idea that we have from the outside is that it doesn't,
Yeah,
that's
but
a
that's not
misconception.
true. So it's not true. It's not true in the data. It's not. So my paper has a lot of data on this, like trying to
Cool.
show actually there's huge amount of social mobility in Africa, and there's enormous. I know that just from my personal experience of working in Africa, working with Africans.
Yeah.
Talented people can always get to the top. I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about that. So that's just one example of. And I think, yeah, you have to solve some institutional problems, and I'm not saying those problems are easy to solve in a place like Nigeria or the DRC, but
Yeah.
underneath that, could I imagine Nigeria starting to grow at 10% a year, or Congo? Absolutely, absolutely. There's just the amount of energy and talent is just staggering. You go to Lagos, it's just amazing now. Lagos is just exploding with energy and more so than Kinshasa, because the Nigerians are they're much further down the road of building institutions, even though there's a lot of problems in Nigeria. But so that's I don't know if that's too romantic, but I can imagine it. And the paper is just kind of basically developing different ideas about how to think about that differently. And it's all based on my personal experience and like just kind of my understandings of how things work in Africa and how that differs so much from how we think about it often.
So Africa is a region and Nigeria is a country.
Nigeria is a region too. Yeah, I mean, there's huge differences between the south of Nigeria and the north of Nigeria, and but Nigeria is not. It's not the only place. You go to Kenya, South Africa, Ghana. There's, of course, there's massive. Africa's not Africa's enormously heterogeneous. There's a huge difference between Chad and southern Nigeria, whatever. But I'm just saying. That's true in China. In China, when the growth happened, it happened in little pockets. It happened in parts of the country, and it still hasn't happened in large parts of China at all. If you go to large parts of the interior of China, they look pretty much like they did in 1978. So I think, and that's true with India as well. So that's always true. Yeah. So I think that's. Let me say that. Yeah.
Fascinating. No, it's amazing. I was really looking forward to asking you that question. Particularly because it is the realm in which you spend all your time thinking. So, you get a nice informed answer. Finally, last question, very easy, nothing to do with the world, geopolitics, culture, or maybe a little bit to do with culture. If you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, who would they be?
Gosh, they had to have lived at the same time?
No, anyone you want.
I think, I'm very interested. Recently, we talked a little bit before about social science and, the kind of where social theory comes from. And, I think it would be interesting they weren't quite contemporaries, but they weren't that far apart. I'd be interested to hear Confucius and Aristotle discuss like politics, because if you read Aristotle's Politics, there's a kind of fundamentally different notion of like what political problems are in society and how you solve them. And also there's fundamentally different assumptions about people's motivation. And you compare that with Confucius, it's completely different. Confucius had very different assumptions about how to get good government and how to get things working and what were people's motivations and what, and those two things are very different. And like, how did they, Aristotle in some sense starts this whole kind of Western tradition, and Confucius starts this other, maybe you can always trace things back before before any book. But he kind of distilled a very different sort of tradition. So I guess it would be fascinating. I'm very fascinated myself personally to sort of understand the implications of those different traditions, but also
That'd be amazing.
why they thought so differently. Like
Yeah.
what led them to conceive of these issues so differently.
Like two alien cultures and worldviews colliding that didn't even know about each other. Yeah. James,
Okay.
it's really been fascinating, and thank you so much for giving me this time. I really,
Okay.
really do
No,
appreciate it.